The very intention of a government is to run the institutions and organisations which uphold the law and protect the people. But what happens when the very same people in charge of power begin to exploit their positions for personal gain? Well, this is something which we've seen playing out all over the world in recent years, and the effects can be catastrophic. This episode covers the evil within governments, looking at the effects of corruption and the misuse of power which have plagued societies both recently but also for centuries, as from ancient empires to modern democracies, the abuse of authority and power by those in charge have left deep scars on society. Now before we jump in, it's important to note, governments are not inherently evil. They are simply made up of human beings which have their flaws and desires, and this is ultimately where most of the problems stem from. The seeds of corruption are often planted by individuals who seek power for their own benefit, and history has shown us how greed, ambition and a thirst for power can turn leaders into tyrants, as people in positions of power often seem to develop some sort of a god complex, believing that they are above the law. Obviously, we have all heard of the worst examples of corruption, and we all know how extreme personal desire can lead to a detriment of a society. We've all heard of Nero in ancient Rome and Stalin in the Soviet Union, but we often forget that corruption still exists in modern society and still plagues our governments to this day. Whilst we just outlined two extreme cases of corruption, corruption can actually mean many things, although it usually involves the abuse of power for personal gain. This could be something as simple as a bribe or as complex as embezzlement or worse. We're all aware that corruption still exists in our modern society, but we often think of this as an issue primarily affecting developing nations. The thing is though, human nature is human nature, and corruption is present in every country around the world. The difference is, in rich nations, our leaders have simply gotten better at covering it up. And whilst corruption within the government isn't often well covered, recent historical instances of corruption are easy enough to learn about. Just look up your country's level of governmental corruption. Chances are you will be inundated with cases of corruption throughout history. And if you think cases like this are still not going on, I would argue that you may be misinformed or confused. But the reason why we don't hear about corruption concurrently is because it runs very deep. Oftentimes people can be bought out relatively cheaply to stop information from getting out. After all, if the public actually knew what was going on, chances are they'd lose their minds, taking their frustrations to the street in the form of protest. The question that we all must ask though is, what is the cost of corruption, both on a country's reputational level but also on an economical level? The problem is, whilst corruption benefits those running things, it distorts markets, reduces economic growth and undermines the rule of law, ultimately affecting living standards for the masses. Whilst extreme cases of this can be seen in many developing nations, where the elites have enriched themselves at the expense of the poor, leading to widespread poverty and inequality, corruption of sorts still exists in rich nations. Quickly focusing on a relevant real-world example of this, anybody who has been in touch with the UK news in recent years knows that serious questions and concerns around corruption and collusion and cronyism have been frequenting the news, highlighting the widespread nature of this. Bear in mind, this is in the UK, a country where the government ranks 78% non-corrupt, and honestly, this is astounding. But what do we do about cases like this? The fight against corruption is an ongoing battle, but can progress be made? Because while some countries have made significant strides, others continue to struggle. International organisations such as the United Nations and the World Bank are working to promote good governance and transparency in developing countries, but the real question is, what happens in developed nations? Fortunately, the progression of our society has led to a point of reasonable equality, where most of us can expect a reasonable quality of life. The thing is though, it's crucial that we uphold this and continue to make strides. The past few years have arguably showcased the amount of power those at the top have, from big businesses to law enforcement all the way to government officials. But what us the common people must not forget is that these people in positions of power are there to serve us. Politics should be a vocation, and those in power should put their interests aside and focus on the interests of the people, as corruption is a genuine threat both to our democracy and social structure. Seriously, in rich nations we have to ask ourselves, is enough being done to combat this, or is the problem just continuing to get worse? This is something which not a lot of people really like to talk about, and you could argue it's because of how deep the corruption runs, resulting in this stuff not being shown on the TV. But bringing awareness to this, and bringing light to this, is crucial. So what do you guys think to this video? Do you agree with the things which we've spoken about? Do you agree that corruption is a real problem that we face in the future? And which instances of corruption have you seen and how have they affected your life? I'd love to know all in the comments, so do of course let us know. That's it for this one though, thank you so much for joining.